Question 1. The risk matrix shows a high probability of a traffic stop due to a minor equipment violation. You are legally licensed to carry a concealed weapon in Wisconsin and have your firearm concealed on your person. As the officer approaches your vehicle, what is the most responsible and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Remain silent and hope the officer does not notice the firearm during the interaction. Option B. Remain calm. Clearly state that you are carrying a concealed weapon and follow all instructions given by the officer. Option C. Immediately reach for your firearm to present it to the officer as you exit the vehicle. Option D. Begin questioning the officer's reasons for the stop and demand to know why you are being stopped. Correct answer is B. Remain calm, clearly state that you are carrying a concealed weapon, and follow all instructions given by the officer. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct confrontation with law enforcement while legally carrying a concealed weapon. The individual's immediate reaction and communication can significantly impact the outcome, potentially leading to misunderstandings, unnecessary escalation, or legal complications. The core challenge lies in balancing the right to carry with the obligation to cooperate with lawful police commands and to avoid actions that could be perceived as threatening. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves remaining calm, clearly stating the presence of the firearm, and following the officer's instructions precisely. This approach is correct because Wisconsin Statute 175-60-11A requires a licensee to promptly inform a law enforcement officer of the presence of a concealed weapon when the licensee knows that the officer is a law enforcement officer. Furthermore, ethical considerations dictate that individuals carrying firearms should do so responsibly, which includes transparent communication with law enforcement during a lawful stop to prevent misinterpretation of their actions and to ensure the safety of all parties involved. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to remain silent and hope the officer does not notice the firearm. This is professionally unacceptable because it directly violates Wisconsin Statute 175-60-11A by failing to promptly inform the officer. This silence can be misinterpreted as an attempt to conceal the weapon, potentially leading to increased suspicion and a more forceful response from the officer. Another incorrect approach is to immediately reach for the firearm to present it to the officer without being instructed to do so. This is professionally unacceptable as it can be perceived as a threatening gesture, potentially escalating the situation and endangering both the individual and the officer. Law enforcement officers are trained to respond to perceived threats, and an unprompted reach for a weapon, even with good intentions, can trigger a defensive reaction. A third incorrect approach is to become argumentative and question the officer's authority to stop them. This is professionally unacceptable because it obstructs a lawful police stop and can be seen as resisting or obstructing an officer, which carries its own legal penalties. Furthermore, it creates a confrontational environment that is counterproductive to resolving the situation safely and efficiently, and it fails to address the immediate requirement to disclose the presence of the firearm. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, legal compliance, and clear communication. When interacting with law enforcement while carrying a concealed weapon, the primary steps are to remain calm, comply with lawful commands, and proactively disclose the presence of the firearm as required by law. This proactive disclosure, coupled with compliance, de-escalates potential conflict and demonstrates responsible firearm ownership. Question 2. The risk matrix shows an individual exhibiting increasingly aggressive behavior in a public park in Wisconsin, approaching your location. You are legally licensed to carry a concealed weapon. What is the most prudent course of action? Option A. Verbally confront the individual, demanding they leave the area and threatening further action if they do not comply. Option B. Continue your current activity, assuming the individual's behavior is not directed at you and will not escalate. Option C. Immediately draw your concealed weapon and adopt a defensive posture to deter the individual from approaching further. Option D. Maintain situational awareness, assess the imminence and severity of the threat, and prepare to de-escalate or retreat if possible, only considering the use of your concealed weapon as a last resort if faced with an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. The correct answer is D. Maintain situational awareness, assess the imminence and severity of the threat, and prepare to de-escalate or retreat if possible, only considering the use of your concealed weapon as a last resort if faced with an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing a threat and determining if the use of deadly force is legally justified and ethically sound, while also considering the potential consequences of any action taken. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal repercussions, including criminal charges and ethical compromise. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves de-escalating the situation and seeking to avoid confrontation whenever possible, while remaining aware of the surroundings and potential escape routes. This approach prioritizes the preservation of life and adherence to Wisconsin's legal standards for the use of deadly force, which generally require an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. If de-escalation is not possible and a threat becomes imminent, the individual must be prepared to act decisively and proportionately, but only as a last resort. This aligns with the principles of self-defense and the legal framework governing concealed carry in Wisconsin, which emphasizes necessity and proportionality. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately drawing the concealed weapon and assuming an aggressive stance upon perceiving a potential threat, even if the threat is not immediate or severe. This action escalates the situation unnecessarily and could be interpreted as an aggressive act rather than a defensive one, potentially violating Wisconsin law regarding the use of force. It fails to consider de-escalation or the legal threshold for using deadly force. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the perceived threat and continue with normal activities without assessing the situation or considering personal safety. While avoiding confrontation is generally advisable, complete inaction in the face of a credible and escalating threat can be dangerous and may not constitute reasonable self-defense if an attack occurs. It neglects the responsibility to protect oneself when legally permitted and necessary. A further incorrect approach is to verbally confront and threaten the individual exhibiting concerning behavior without any physical action. While verbal de-escalation can be effective, issuing threats can escalate the situation and potentially lead to legal issues for the carrier, especially if the threats are perceived as aggressive or are not directly related to immediate self-defense. It also fails to account for the possibility of the situation devolving into physical violence where verbal threats are insufficient. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes situational awareness, threat assessment, and de-escalation. This involves continuously observing the environment, identifying potential risks, and evaluating the imminence and severity of any perceived threat. If a threat is identified, the primary goal should be to disengage or de-escalate. Only when faced with an unavoidable and imminent threat of death or great bodily harm, and all other options have been exhausted, should the use of a concealed weapon be considered as a last resort, in strict accordance with Wisconsin statutes. Question 3. Process analysis reveals that while carrying a concealed weapon legally in Wisconsin, you are approached in a crowded grocery store aisle by an individual who is visibly agitated, speaking loudly, and gesturing aggressively in your general direction, but not directly at you. They have not made any direct threats or physical contact. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action to uphold both your right to self-defense and legal obligations? Option A. Verbally confront the agitated individual aggressively, demanding they leave you alone and move away. Option B. Ignore the agitated individual completely and continue your shopping as if they were not there. Option C. Attempt to verbally de-escalate the situation by speaking calmly to the individual and simultaneously begin to slowly back away to create more physical space. Option D. Immediately draw your concealed weapon and assume a defensive posture, ready to defend yourself. The correct answer is C. Attempt to verbally de-escalate the situation by speaking calmly to the individual and simultaneously begin to slowly back away to create more physical space. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate a situation where a potential threat exists, but the immediate circumstances do not definitively meet the legal threshold for the use of deadly force under Wisconsin law. The individual must balance their right to self-defense with the legal and ethical obligations to avoid unnecessary violence, and to act only when faced with an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Misjudging the situation could lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and ethical repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves de-escalation and creating distance. This means verbally attempting to calm the agitated individual and simultaneously backing away to increase the safe space between them. This approach is correct because Wisconsin Statute 939:48 1 defines self-defense as the use of force only when a person reasonably believes such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm. By de-escalating and creating distance, the individual is actively working to avoid the necessity of using force, thereby adhering to the principle that force should be a last resort. This aligns with the ethical duty to preserve life and avoid harm whenever possible. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately draw the concealed weapon and assume a defensive stance. This is a failure because Wisconsin law requires a reasonable belief of imminent death or great bodily harm before resorting to force. Simply being confronted by an agitated individual without overt actions indicating an immediate intent to inflict such harm does not meet this legal threshold. This action could be interpreted as an escalation rather than a response to an imminent threat, potentially violating the spirit and letter of self-defense statutes. Another incorrect approach is to verbally confront the agitated individual aggressively and demand they leave. While verbal commands can be part of de-escalation, an aggressive tone can easily escalate the situation further, potentially transforming a tense encounter into a violent one. This approach fails to prioritize the creation of safe distance and may provoke the agitated individual, increasing the likelihood of a physical confrontation that could then necessitate the use of force, which the individual was trying to avoid. A further incorrect approach is to ignore the agitated individual and continue with the original activity without acknowledging their presence or the potential threat. While avoiding confrontation is sometimes wise, completely disregarding a visibly agitated person in close proximity can be dangerous. It fails to assess the evolving threat and misses opportunities for de-escalation or creating a safer environment. This passive approach, without any attempt to create distance or assess the situation, could leave the individual vulnerable if the agitated person decides to act aggressively. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes threat assessment, de-escalation, and adherence to legal statutes. First, assess the immediate threat level. Is there an imminent danger of death or great bodily harm? Second, attempt de-escalation through calm, clear communication and by creating physical distance. Third, if de-escalation fails and the threat escalates to meet the legal threshold for self-defense, then and only then should the use of force be considered as a last resort, strictly in accordance with Wisconsin Statute 939:48. Question 4. The performance metrics show a slight increase in reported incidents involving potential confrontations in public spaces across Wisconsin. You are carrying a concealed weapon legally under Wisconsin law. You are approached by an individual who is verbally aggressive and making vague threats, but they are not physically advancing on you and are maintaining a distance of approximately 15 feet. They are not displaying any weapons. What is the most appropriate course of action to legally and ethically manage this situation? Option A. Focus on protecting your property in the vicinity, as the individual's aggressive behavior could escalate to property damage or theft. Option B. Immediately draw your concealed weapon and issue a verbal warning to deter the individual, as their aggression and threats indicate a potential for future harm. Option C. Use deadly force to neutralize the threat, as the individual's verbal aggression and vague threats create an unacceptable risk to your safety and the safety of others. Option D. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Prioritize de-escalation or creating distance if safe to do so, and only consider the use of deadly force if the individual's actions create a clear and present danger of imminent death or great bodily harm. The correct answer is D. Assess the situation for an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Prioritize de-escalation or creating distance if safe to do so, and only consider the use of deadly force if the individual's actions create a clear and present danger of imminent death or great bodily harm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. The core challenge lies in accurately assessing a threat and determining when the use of deadly force is legally justifiable under Wisconsin law, while also considering the potential legal and ethical ramifications of any action taken. Misjudgment can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and civil liability, as well as ethical condemnation. Correct approach analysis. The best professional approach involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to Wisconsin Statute 939-48, which defines the justifiable use of force. This statute permits the use of deadly force only when a person reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to themselves or another person, or to prevent the commission of a felony. Therefore, the correct approach is to only consider the use of deadly force if the immediate circumstances present a clear and present danger of death or severe injury, and there are no reasonable alternatives to de-escalation or escape. This aligns with the legal standard of necessity and proportionality. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to consider using deadly force based on a generalized fear or a perceived future threat. Wisconsin law requires an imminent threat, not a speculative one. Acting on a feeling of unease or a potential future danger, without an immediate and concrete threat of death or great bodily harm, would violate the legal standard and could lead to criminal charges. Another incorrect approach is to use deadly force to protect property alone. Wisconsin law, as outlined in Statute 939-48, does not permit the use of deadly force solely for the protection of property. While property can be a factor in assessing the totality of circumstances, it is not a sufficient justification for deadly force in itself. A further incorrect approach is to use deadly force as a punitive measure or in retaliation after a threat has passed. The justification for using deadly force is strictly limited to preventing imminent harm. Once the threat is no longer immediate, the legal justification for using deadly force ceases to exist. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance and ethical responsibility. This involves 1. Threat assessment. Continuously and objectively assess the imminence and severity of any threat. 2. Legal justification. Understand and apply the specific legal standards for the use of force in Wisconsin, particularly Statute 939-48. 3. De-escalation and escape. Prioritize de-escalation techniques and opportunities for safe escape whenever possible. 4. Proportionality. Ensure that any force used is proportionate to the threat faced. 5. Post-incident protocol. Be aware of and follow proper procedures for reporting and documenting any use of force incident. Question 5. Regulatory review indicates that a Wisconsin resident who holds a valid license to carry a concealed weapon has recently moved to a new address within the state. The individual is unsure if their current license remains valid for carrying a concealed weapon at their new residence and has not yet formally notified any state agency of the address change. What is the most appropriate course of action for this individual to ensure continued legal compliance with Wisconsin's concealed carry laws? Option A. Immediately contact the Wisconsin Department of Justice to inquire about the process for updating their address on their concealed carry license and confirm the current validity of their permit. Option B. Assume that a new license with the updated address will be automatically issued by the state once the move is registered with other government agencies. Option C. Continue carrying a concealed weapon using the existing license, assuming it remains valid until its official expiration date, and plan to update the address when renewing the permit. Option D. Wait until the concealed carry license is within 90 days of its expiration date to initiate the process of updating their address and renewing the permit. The correct answer is A. Immediately contact the Wisconsin Department of Justice to inquire about the process for updating their address on their concealed carry license and confirm the current validity of their permit. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate the intersection of personal circumstances and legal requirements for firearm possession. The individual's recent relocation and the potential for a lapse in their concealed carry permit create a situation where they must proactively ensure compliance with Wisconsin law to avoid legal repercussions. The core challenge lies in understanding the specific requirements for maintaining a valid license when moving within the state and the implications of carrying a concealed weapon without a current, valid permit. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately contacting the Wisconsin Department of Justice, DOJ, to inquire about the specific procedures for updating the address on an existing concealed carry license and to confirm the validity of the current license. This approach is correct because Wisconsin Statute 175(60)(11) mandates that a licensee must notify the DOJ of any change of address within 30 days. Proactively seeking clarification from the issuing authority ensures accurate information and allows the individual to take the necessary steps to maintain legal compliance. This demonstrates a commitment to upholding the law and responsible firearm ownership. Incorrect approach is analysis. Failing to update the address and assuming the license remains valid until its expiration date is a regulatory failure. Wisconsin law requires notification of address changes, and carrying a concealed weapon with an outdated address on the permit, even if the permit itself is not expired, could be considered a violation of the notification requirement. Assuming that a new license is automatically issued or that the old license is still valid without verification is also a regulatory failure. The law specifies a notification process, not an automatic update. Relying on assumptions without confirming with the DOJ could lead to unknowingly carrying a weapon without a legally compliant permit. Waiting until the permit is close to expiration to address the address change is a risky approach. While it might not be an immediate violation, it increases the chance of the permit lapsing or encountering delays in updating the information, potentially leading to a period of unlawful concealed carry. This approach lacks the proactive diligence required for responsible firearm ownership. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing similar situations should adopt a proactive and information-seeking approach. The decision-making process should involve 1. Identifying the relevant legal requirements, in this case, Wisconsin Statute 175(60) regarding concealed carry licenses and address changes. 2. Recognizing potential conflicts or ambiguities arising from personal circumstances, like relocation. 3. Prioritizing direct communication with the issuing authority, Wisconsin DOJ, to obtain accurate and up-to-date information. 4. Taking immediate action to rectify any identified compliance issues. This systematic approach ensures adherence to legal mandates and promotes responsible conduct. Question 6. Performance analysis shows that a Wisconsin licensee with a valid permit is considering entering a private establishment that serves both food and alcoholic beverages. The licensee is unsure whether their permit allows them to carry a concealed weapon inside this particular establishment. What is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for the licensee to take? Option A. Proceed to carry the concealed weapon, assuming it is permissible because the establishment serves food. Option B. Carry the concealed weapon, assuming it is permissible as long as the establishment is not exclusively a bar. Option C. Ascertain the establishment's primary business operations and check for any posted signage prohibiting firearms before entering. Option D. Leave the firearms secured in their vehicle and enter the establishment unarmed. The correct answer is C. Ascertain the establishment's primary business operations and check for any posted signage prohibiting firearms before entering. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge for concealed carry permit holders in Wisconsin, navigating the nuances of carrying a firearm in a private establishment that serves alcohol. The core difficulty lies in understanding the specific prohibitions and exceptions outlined in Wisconsin law, particularly when the establishment's primary business is not alcohol sales, but alcohol is served. A permit holder must exercise careful judgment to avoid violating state statutes, which could lead to criminal charges and the revocation of their permit. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice is to ascertain the specific nature of the establishment's operations and the presence of any posted signage. Wisconsin Statute 943(13)(1) (BM) prohibits carrying a concealed weapon in a tavern, which is defined as a place where the principal business is the sale of intoxicating liquors or fermented malt beverages for consumption on the premises. However, it also states an exception if the person is a patron of a restaurant and the establishment has a Class B license but the principal business is food service. Therefore, determining if the establishment's principal business is food service versus alcohol sales and checking for any posted prohibitions is the most legally sound and responsible course of action. This approach directly addresses the statutory requirements and avoids assumptions. Incorrect approach is analysis. Choosing to carry the firearm without verifying the establishment's primary business or checking for signage is a failure to exercise due diligence. This approach risks violating Wisconsin Statute 943:13(1) BM if the establishment is indeed a tavern where alcohol consumption on the premises is the principal business. Demonstrates a lack of awareness of the specific legal distinctions that determine the legality of carrying a concealed weapon in such locations. Assuming it is permissible to carry, because the establishment also serves food, without confirming that food service is the principal business, is also a regulatory failure. While Wisconsin law provides an exception for restaurants, this exception is contingent on the principal business being food service, not merely the presence of food on the menu. This assumption could lead to a violation if the establishment's primary revenue and focus are on alcohol sales. Leaving the firearm in the vehicle and proceeding into the establishment, while a safe choice in terms of avoiding legal entanglements related to carrying, is not the most informed approach to exercising one's rights as a permit holder. The question implies the individual wishes to carry. This option avoids the legal issue, but doesn't address the core of understanding the law's application to the situation. It represents a conservative choice to avoid risk rather than an informed decision based on legal understanding. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and informed approach. This involves thoroughly understanding Wisconsin's concealed carry laws, particularly those pertaining to prohibited locations. When faced with ambiguity, the professional decision-making process should prioritize seeking clarification through direct inquiry or by carefully observing and interpreting signage and the establishment's operational focus. The guiding principle is to act in full compliance with the law, avoiding assumptions that could lead to legal repercussions. Question 7. The assessment process reveals that a Wisconsin resident who is legally licensed to carry a concealed weapon believes they are facing an increased personal safety risk due to recent neighborhood incidents. They are considering carrying their handgun concealed into a local public library, a location explicitly listed as a prohibited place under Wisconsin Statute 943:10. The resident feels that the library is a safe haven and that carrying their weapon there is a necessary precaution for their personal protection. What is the legally and ethically sound course of action for this individual? Option A. Do not carry the concealed weapon into the public library, as it is a prohibited location under Wisconsin law, regardless of personal safety concerns. Option B. Carry the concealed weapon into the public library, relying on the advice of a friend who also carries and believes personal safety concerns override specific location restrictions. Option C. Carry the concealed weapon into the public library, assuming that as long as the weapon remains concealed and is not brandished, it does not violate the spirit of the law. Option D. Carry the concealed weapon into the public library, believing that the perceived threat justifies an exception to the general prohibition for personal protection. The correct answer is A. Do not carry the concealed weapon into the public library, as it is a prohibited location under Wisconsin law, regardless of personal safety concerns. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to navigate a situation where their personal beliefs and perceived rights might conflict with the strict legal requirements for carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. The individual's interpretation of self-defense needs to be grounded in Wisconsin law, not just personal feelings. Misinterpreting or overextending the scope of permissible concealed carry can lead to serious legal consequences. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves understanding and adhering strictly to Wisconsin Statute 943:10, which defines the legal parameters for carrying a concealed weapon. The statute outlines specific locations where carrying a concealed weapon is prohibited, regardless of the perceived threat. The correct approach is to recognize that the individual's personal belief about needing to carry for protection in a prohibited area does not override the law. Therefore, the individual must comply with the law by not carrying the weapon in that specific location. This aligns with the legal duty to know and follow the concealed carry regulations in Wisconsin. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves believing that a perceived threat or a general sense of needing protection justifies carrying a concealed weapon in a prohibited location. This fails to acknowledge that Wisconsin law explicitly defines prohibited places, and personal justification does not create an exception to these statutes. This approach disregards the legal framework, designed to balance the right to carry with public safety concerns in specific environments. Another incorrect approach is to assume that if the weapon is not immediately visible, it is not considered concealed, in a way that violates the law, even in a prohibited area. Wisconsin law defines concealed carry broadly, and the intent is to prevent weapons in places where they are deemed inappropriate or pose a higher risk. The visibility of the weapon is secondary to its presence in a prohibited zone. A further incorrect approach is to rely on informal advice or personal interpretations of self-defense laws without consulting the specific statutes. This can lead to a dangerous misunderstanding of legal boundaries. The law is the ultimate authority, and personal interpretations or hearsay are not legally binding and can result in criminal charges. Professional reasoning. Professionals in Wisconsin must adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes legal compliance above all else when it comes to carrying a concealed weapon. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding Wisconsin Statute 943(10) and any other relevant statutes regarding concealed carry. 2. Recognizing that personal feelings of safety or perceived threats do not supersede legal prohibitions on carrying in specific locations. 3. Consulting official legal resources or legal counsel if there is any ambiguity about the law. 4. Making decisions based on established legal boundaries, not on personal interpretations or informal advice. Question 8. Stakeholder feedback indicates a need for clearer guidance on interactions with law enforcement while carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. Imagine you are a licensed individual lawfully carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin and are stopped by a police officer for a minor traffic violation. The officer approaches your vehicle and asks for your license and registration. What is the most appropriate and legally compliant course of action? Option A. Immediately reach for your concealed weapon to present it to the officer before they ask any questions about it. Option B. Remain silent about possessing a concealed weapon and wait to see if the officer discovers it or asks specifically about firearms. Option C. Promptly and clearly inform the officer that you are a licensee in possession of a concealed weapon, while simultaneously complying with all other lawful commands from the officer. Option D. Attempt to discreetly move the concealed weapon to a less accessible location on your person, without the officer's knowledge. The correct answer is C. Promptly and clearly inform the officer that you are a licensee in possession of a concealed weapon, while simultaneously complying with all other lawful commands from the officer. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of Wisconsin law regarding the use of deadly force and the permissible locations for carrying a concealed weapon, particularly when encountering law enforcement. Misinterpreting these laws can lead to severe legal consequences, including criminal charges and the revocation of a concealed carry license. Careful judgment is required to ensure actions taken are both legally permissible and ethically sound. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves immediately and clearly identifying oneself as a licensee in possession of a concealed weapon to the law enforcement officer, while simultaneously complying with the officer's lawful commands and refraining from any actions that could be perceived as a threat. This approach is correct because Wisconsin Statute 175(12)(m) requires a licensee to promptly disclose their status as a licensee in possession of a concealed weapon to a law enforcement officer upon being lawfully commanded to do so. Furthermore, the fundamental ethical and legal principle of cooperating with law enforcement during a lawful stop is paramount. By clearly communicating their status and remaining compliant, the individual avoids escalating the situation and upholds their legal duty. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves remaining silent and making no disclosure to the officer, hoping the situation resolves without the need for explanation. This fails to meet the statutory requirement of prompt disclosure when lawfully commanded, potentially leading to misunderstandings and accusations of non-compliance or obstruction. It also disregards the ethical imperative to be transparent with law enforcement when carrying a firearm. Another incorrect approach is to immediately reach for the firearm to present it to the officer without being instructed to do so. This action, while potentially intended to be cooperative, can be perceived as a threatening gesture by the officer, creating a dangerous situation and violating the principle of de-escalation. Wisconsin law does not mandate the immediate presentation of the firearm unless specifically directed by the officer. A third incorrect approach is to attempt to conceal the firearm further or move it to a different location on one's person without instruction. This action directly contravenes the requirement to disclose the presence of the weapon and could be interpreted as an attempt to hide evidence or evade lawful scrutiny, leading to serious legal repercussions and a breach of trust with law enforcement. Professional reasoning. Professionals carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes legal compliance, officer safety, and de-escalation. This involves understanding the specific disclosure requirements under Wisconsin Statute 175-60, 12M, recognizing the authority of law enforcement officers and practicing calm, compliant behavior during interactions. When stopped by law enforcement, the immediate mental checklist should be: 1. Remain calm. 2. Comply with lawful commands. 3. If asked or commanded, promptly disclose status as a licensee in possession of a concealed weapon. 4. Avoid any sudden movements or actions that could be perceived as a threat. This systematic approach ensures adherence to legal obligations and promotes a safe outcome for all parties involved. Question 9. The risk matrix shows a patron in a Wisconsin establishment exhibiting increasingly agitated behavior, pacing erratically and speaking loudly to themselves, while visibly carrying a concealed firearm as permitted by their license. What is the most prudent and legally compliant course of action for a bystander concerned for public safety? Option A. Maintain a safe distance. Observe the individual's behavior for any immediate threats, and if the behavior escalates to a point of clear danger, contact law enforcement to report the observed behavior and request assistance. Option B. Immediately approach the individual and politely, but firmly ask them to show you their concealed carry permit and explain their agitated behavior. Option C. Ignore the situation completely, as the individual is legally carrying a firearm and their behavior, while unusual, does not directly involve you. Option D. Call law enforcement and report the individual as a dangerous person who is likely to commit a crime due to their agitated state and concealed weapon. The correct answer is A. Maintain a safe distance, observe the individual's behavior for any immediate threats, and if the behavior escalates to a point of clear danger, contact law enforcement to report the observed behavior and request assistance. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it involves a direct confrontation with an individual who is exhibiting concerning behavior while legally carrying a concealed weapon. The challenge lies in balancing the right of the individual to carry a concealed weapon with the responsibility to ensure public safety and de-escalate a potentially volatile situation without resorting to unnecessary force or violating the individual's rights. The presence of a concealed weapon elevates the stakes, requiring a measured and legally compliant response. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves maintaining a safe distance, observing the individual's behavior for any immediate threats, and if necessary, contacting law enforcement to assess the situation. This approach prioritizes safety by not directly engaging a potentially agitated individual with a firearm. It recognizes that the individual's behavior, while concerning, may not yet constitute a direct threat that warrants immediate intervention by a civilian. Contacting law enforcement allows for a trained and authorized response, ensuring that any necessary action is taken within the bounds of Wisconsin law. This aligns with the principle of using reasonable force and avoiding unnecessary escalation, as well as the legal framework surrounding concealed carry, which permits carrying, but does not grant authority to act as a law enforcement officer. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately confront the individual and demand they reveal their concealed weapon. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Wisconsin law permits individuals with a valid license to carry a concealed weapon. Demanding to see the weapon without probable cause or a lawful reason to believe a crime is being committed or is about to be committed is an overreach of authority and could be construed as harassment or intimidation, potentially leading to legal repercussions for the person making the demand. It also unnecessarily escalates the situation and could provoke a dangerous reaction. Another incorrect approach is to ignore the behavior entirely, even if it appears increasingly erratic and potentially threatening. The individual has a right to carry. their behavior could indicate a mental health crisis or an intent to cause harm. Ignoring such signs without any attempt to assess the situation or ensure public safety is a dereliction of the ethical responsibility to act with reasonable care towards others in a public space. It fails to consider the potential risk to oneself and others. A third incorrect approach is to call law enforcement and immediately report the individual as a dangerous criminal solely based on their concealed weapon and erratic behavior, without further observation. While contacting law enforcement is appropriate, making an unsubstantiated accusation of criminality can lead to an unwarranted and potentially harmful police intervention. The focus should be on reporting observed concerning behavior, allowing law enforcement to make their own assessment, rather than prejudging the individual's intent. Professional reasoning. Professionals encountering such a situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, legal compliance, and de-escalation. This involves 1. Situational awareness. Assess the environment and the individual's behavior from a safe distance. 2. Threat assessment. Determine if the behavior constitutes an immediate threat to oneself or others. 3. Legal boundaries. Understand one's own rights and limitations, and the rights of the individual. 4. Communication if necessary and safe. If direct engagement is unavoidable and safe, use calm and clear communication. 5. Escalation protocol. Know when and how to contact appropriate authorities, e.g., law enforcement, and provide clear factual information. 6. Documentation. Record observations and actions taken. In this specific scenario, the primary focus is on observing and, if necessary, reporting to law enforcement, rather than direct confrontation or assumption of authority. Question 10. Operational review demonstrates that a Wisconsin licensee for carrying a concealed weapon has maintained a personal ammunition inventory for their handgun. The licensee estimates they have approximately 500 rounds of 9mm ammunition. They store the ammunition in a plastic bin in their garage, which is accessible to other adult family members but is not locked. The licensee has not kept a detailed log of ammunition purchases or expenditures, relying on occasional visual checks. If the licensee were to conduct a precise inventory count and compare it to their last known acquisition date, what is the minimum number of rounds they would need to account for to ensure no more than a 5% discrepancy from their estimated total, assuming their initial estimate was accurate? Option A, 500 rounds. Option B, 475 rounds. Option C, 450 rounds. Option D, 400 rounds. Correct answer is B, 475 rounds. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge related to the responsible management of ammunition inventory for a licensed concealed carry permit holder in Wisconsin. The core difficulty lies in balancing the need for readily accessible ammunition for self-defense with the legal and ethical obligations to store it securely and prevent unauthorized access. Mismanagement can lead to serious legal repercussions and compromise public safety. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a systematic approach to inventory management that prioritizes security and compliance. This includes maintaining a detailed, up-to-date log of all ammunition, noting the type, quantity, and date of acquisition or expenditure. Furthermore, implementing a secure storage system, such as a locked container or safe, that is inaccessible to unauthorized individuals, particularly minors, is paramount. Regular physical counts and reconciliation with the log are essential to identify any discrepancies promptly. This approach directly aligns with Wisconsin Statute 948-60, possession of a dangerous weapon by a child, and the general principles of responsible firearm ownership, which emphasize preventing access by prohibited persons. Incorrect approach is analysis. An approach that relies solely on visual estimation of ammunition quantities without a formal log or secure storage is professionally deficient. This method is prone to significant inaccuracies, making it impossible to detect potential losses or unauthorized use. It fails to meet the standard of due diligence required for responsible firearm ownership, and could indirectly contribute to violations of child access prevention laws if a child were to gain access. Another unprofessional approach involves storing ammunition in easily accessible locations within the home, such as kitchen drawers or bedside tables, without any form of locking mechanism. This directly contravenes the spirit and intent of laws designed to prevent accidental discharge or access by minors, creating an unacceptable risk of harm. It demonstrates a disregard for the inherent dangers associated with firearms and ammunition. Finally, an approach that involves infrequent or no inventory checks, assuming quantities are stable, is also problematic. This passive management style can mask issues for extended periods, potentially allowing for significant discrepancies to go unnoticed. It lacks the proactive risk mitigation necessary for responsible firearm and ammunition stewardship. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and systematic risk management framework. This involves understanding all applicable laws and regulations, e.g., Wisconsin statutes related to firearm and child safety, identifying potential risks, e.g., unauthorized access, loss, theft, and implementing robust control measures, e.g., secure storage, detailed record keeping, regular audits. A continuous improvement mindset, where inventory management practices are regularly reviewed and updated, is crucial for maintaining compliance and ensuring safety. Question 11. Quality control measures reveal that some applicants for a Wisconsin license to carry a concealed weapon may not fully engage in preemptive risk assessment. Considering the legal and ethical obligations of a concealed carry license holder in Wisconsin, which of the following represents the most responsible and legally sound approach to risk assessment prior to carrying a concealed weapon? Option A. Focus exclusively on maintaining the mechanical readiness and proficiency of the firearm, without significant consideration for the legal or situational context of carrying. Option B. Assume that possessing a valid Wisconsin license to carry a concealed weapon is sufficient to cover all potential legal and situational risks. Option C. Rely primarily on advice from friends and online forums for information regarding where and when it is permissible to carry a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. Option D. Conduct a thorough review of personal circumstances to ensure continued eligibility. Familiarize oneself with all current Wisconsin statutes and administrative rules regarding prohibited locations and circumstances for carrying a concealed weapon, and understand the legal consequences of violations. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough review of personal circumstances to ensure continued eligibility. Familiarize oneself with all current Wisconsin statutes and administrative rules regarding prohibited locations and circumstances for carrying a concealed weapon, and understand the legal consequences of violations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an applicant to proactively identify and mitigate potential risks associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin, even before an incident occurs. The challenge lies in moving beyond a passive understanding of the law to an active, risk-aware mindset. It demands foresight and a commitment to responsible gun ownership that prioritizes public safety and legal compliance. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a comprehensive self-assessment of personal circumstances and a thorough understanding of Wisconsin's legal framework for carrying a concealed weapon. This approach is correct because Wisconsin Statute 941:23, which governs concealed carry, implicitly requires individuals to be legally eligible and to exercise due care. Proactively reviewing one's eligibility, understanding the specific locations where carrying is prohibited, e.g., schools, courthouses, federal buildings, and being aware of the legal ramifications of misuse are fundamental to responsible concealed carry. This aligns with the ethical imperative to prevent harm and uphold the law. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves assuming that simply possessing a valid Wisconsin concealed carry license absolves the individual of all further responsibility regarding risk assessment. This is a failure because the license is permission to carry, not a guarantee of safe or legal conduct in all situations. It overlooks the dynamic nature of legal restrictions and the potential for personal circumstances to change, which could impact eligibility or create new risks. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on the advice of friends or informal sources regarding legal restrictions. This is professionally unacceptable as it bypasses the authoritative and legally binding information provided by Wisconsin statutes and official training. Informal advice can be inaccurate, outdated, or incomplete, leading to unintentional violations. Finally, an approach that focuses only on the technical aspects of firearm maintenance and ignores the legal and situational risks demonstrates a significant gap in responsible gun ownership. While firearm proficiency is important, it does not address the legal and ethical obligations associated with carrying a concealed weapon in public. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and informed approach to concealed carry. This involves a continuous cycle of learning and self-evaluation. Before carrying and periodically thereafter, individuals should 1. Reconfirm their eligibility under Wisconsin law. 2. Review current Wisconsin statutes and administrative rules pertaining to concealed carry, paying close attention to prohibited locations and circumstances. 3. Consider their personal circumstances and any potential factors that might affect their judgment or ability to carry safely and legally. 4. Seek information from official sources, such as the Wisconsin Department of Justice or certified firearms instructors, rather than relying on informal channels. This systematic approach ensures a robust understanding of responsibilities and minimizes the risk of legal or ethical breaches. Question 12. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a concealed carry permit holder in Wisconsin is approached by an agitated individual who begins shouting aggressively and gesturing wildly, but remains at a distance of approximately 15 feet. What is the most prudent course of action to mitigate risk? Option A. Focus solely on the fact that you are armed and assume the individual will back down due to your concealed weapon. Option B. Maintain situational awareness. Avoid engaging with the agitated individual, and be prepared to create distance or seek cover if the situation escalates to an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm. Option C. Respond verbally with equally aggressive language to assert dominance and discourage further confrontation. Option D. Immediately draw your concealed firearm to deter the agitated individual from escalating their aggressive behavior. Correct answer is B. Maintain situational awareness. Avoid engaging with the agitated individual, and be prepared to create distance or seek cover if the situation escalates to an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the legal right to carry a concealed weapon in Wisconsin with the responsibility to act prudently and avoid escalating potentially volatile situations. The core of the challenge lies in assessing the immediate threat and determining the appropriate response, which must be grounded in Wisconsin law and ethical considerations of self-defense and de-escalation. Misjudgment can lead to legal repercussions, injury, or death. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a thorough, real-time assessment of the immediate threat to oneself or others, considering the totality of the circumstances. This includes evaluating the aggressor's actions, intent, capability, and proximity, while also considering the presence of innocent bystanders and the environment. The Wisconsin concealed carry laws permit the use of deadly force only when there is an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Therefore, the correct approach is to maintain situational awareness, avoid unnecessary confrontation, and only draw or use a weapon as a last resort when all other reasonable means of escape or de-escalation have been exhausted and the threat is immediate and severe. This aligns with Wisconsin Statute 939-48, which outlines the justifiable use of force in self-defense. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately draw the firearm upon perceiving any sign of aggression or confrontation, regardless of the severity or immediacy of the threat. This fails to adhere to the legal standard of imminent threat required for the use of deadly force in Wisconsin. It demonstrates a lack of judgment and an overreaction, potentially escalating a situation that could have been resolved without the display of a weapon, and could lead to charges if the threat was not truly imminent. Another incorrect approach is to engage verbally with an aggressive individual in a manner that is confrontational or provocative, thereby escalating the situation. While communication can sometimes de-escalate, aggressive or challenging language can have the opposite effect, increasing the likelihood of violence. This approach disregards the principle of de-escalation and the importance of maintaining a safe distance and avoiding actions that could be perceived as a challenge. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on the presence of a concealed weapon as a deterrent without actively assessing the evolving threat. While carrying a weapon provides a means of defense, it does not negate the need for situational awareness and prudent decision-making. Failing to continuously assess the threat and the environment, and instead assuming the weapon alone will prevent harm, is a dangerous oversight that can lead to being caught unprepared. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of conflict. This involves constant situational awareness, assessing the intent and capability of any perceived threat, and understanding the legal parameters for the use of force in Wisconsin. The decision to draw or use a weapon should be the absolute last resort, undertaken only when there is a clear and present danger of death or great bodily harm, and all other reasonable options have been exhausted. This framework emphasizes responsible gun ownership and the ethical application of self-defense rights. Question 13. Benchmark analysis indicates that individuals licensed to carry concealed weapons in Wisconsin must exercise sound judgment when assessing potential risks in public spaces. Considering the legal and ethical responsibilities of a licensee, which of the following represents the most prudent approach when entering a crowded public venue where one feels a general sense of unease? Option A. Maintain heightened situational awareness, observing for specific behaviors or environmental factors that indicate a credible threat, while remaining discreet and avoiding any actions that could escalate tension. Option B. Discreetly display the firearm to signal preparedness and deter potential aggressors, while continuing to monitor the surroundings. Option C. Immediately seek out individuals who appear to be acting suspiciously based on their attire or group affiliation and position oneself to observe them closely. Option D. Rely on a general feeling of discomfort to justify remaining on high alert and actively scanning for potential threats without specific observable indicators. The correct answer is A. Maintain heightened situational awareness, observing for specific behaviors or environmental factors that indicate a credible threat, while remaining discreet and avoiding any actions that could escalate tension. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to assess potential risks associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin, balancing personal safety considerations with legal obligations and responsible firearm ownership. The challenge lies in accurately identifying and mitigating potential threats without resorting to assumptions or discriminatory practices, all while adhering to Wisconsin's specific statutes. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a proactive and objective assessment of the immediate environment and any observable behaviors that suggest a credible threat to personal safety. This approach prioritizes de-escalation and avoidance of confrontation whenever possible, recognizing that the mere presence of individuals or groups does not inherently constitute a threat. It aligns with the principle of responsible concealed carry, which emphasizes using a firearm only as a last resort for self-defense against imminent danger, as permitted under Wisconsin law. This method focuses on factual observation and threat assessment rather than subjective fear or prejudice. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves making assumptions about potential threats based on the appearance or perceived affiliation of individuals or groups. This is ethically unsound and can lead to discriminatory actions, violating the principles of equal treatment and potentially misinterpreting lawful behavior as threatening. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on a generalized feeling of unease without any specific, observable indicators of danger. While intuition can play a role, it must be grounded in objective observations to justify any defensive actions or heightened vigilance, as Wisconsin law requires a reasonable belief of imminent danger. Finally, an approach that prioritizes displaying the firearm as a deterrent, rather than concealing it as legally required, is a direct violation of Wisconsin's concealed carry statutes and can escalate a situation unnecessarily, creating a greater risk. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with situational awareness, followed by objective threat assessment based on observable behaviors and environmental factors. This framework emphasizes de-escalation, avoidance, and the lawful use of force only when absolutely necessary and legally justified. It requires continuous evaluation of the situation and adherence to all relevant Wisconsin statutes governing the carrying and use of concealed weapons. Question 14. The efficiency study reveals that the current risk assessment process for concealed carry permit applications in Wisconsin may be overlooking critical indicators of potential danger. A new applicant has a history of minor traffic violations and a single documented instance of a verbal altercation at a public event several years ago, which did not result in any charges or arrests. The applicant presents as calm and cooperative during the interview. Considering Wisconsin statutes related to the issuance of concealed carry licenses, which of the following approaches best mitigates the risk of issuing a license to an individual who may pose a danger to public safety? Option A. Expedite the application process by relying on readily available public records and the applicant's self-reported information, as a comprehensive background check may be overly time-consuming and unnecessary for most applicants. Option B. Prioritize the applicant's overall driving record and any minor public disturbances, as these suggest a general disregard for rules and authority that could translate to irresponsible firearm handling. Option C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's criminal history, mental health adjudications, and any restraining orders or injunctions to identify documented instances of violent behavior or findings that indicate a propensity for harm, while also considering the context and severity of any past incidents. Option D. Focus primarily on the applicant's current demeanor and perceived level of calmness during the interview, as this is a strong indicator of their ability to handle a firearm responsibly. Correct answer is C. Conduct a thorough review of the applicant's criminal history, mental health adjudications, and any restraining orders or injunctions to identify documented instances of violent behavior or findings that indicate a propensity for harm, while also considering the context and severity of any past incidents. Explanation. The efficiency study reveals a need to reevaluate the risk assessment protocols for concealed carry permit holders in Wisconsin. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the constitutional right to bear arms with the state's compelling interest in public safety. A careful judgment is required to ensure that risk assessments are thorough, objective, and consistently applied, without infringing on individual rights or creating undue burdens. The core of the challenge lies in identifying individuals who pose a demonstrable risk to themselves or others, based on objective criteria, while respecting due process. The best approach involves a comprehensive review of an applicant's history, focusing on documented instances of violence, threats, or behavior that indicates a propensity for harm, as defined by Wisconsin statutes. This includes a thorough examination of criminal records, mental health adjudications, and any restraining orders or injunctions that demonstrate a clear and present danger. The justification for this approach is rooted in Wisconsin Statute 941. 23(2)(b), which outlines disqualifying factors for a license to carry a concealed weapon, such as a history of violent behavior or a finding of mental defect. This method prioritizes objective, verifiable evidence to assess risk, aligning with legal requirements and promoting public safety through a structured, evidence-based process. An approach that relies solely on subjective impressions or generalized concerns about an applicant's demeanor or perceived attitude is professionally unacceptable. This fails to meet the objective standards required by Wisconsin law and opens the door to discriminatory practices. Such an approach lacks a basis in verifiable facts and cannot withstand legal scrutiny, potentially leading to wrongful denials of licenses or, conversely, the issuance of licenses to individuals who pose a genuine risk. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to focus exclusively on past minor infractions that do not demonstrate a propensity for violence or a current threat to public safety. While a complete record is important, the risk assessment must be tailored to identify behaviors that are directly relevant to the safe carrying of a concealed weapon. Overemphasizing minor, unrelated offenses without considering their context or severity can lead to an inaccurate assessment of an individual's risk. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed and efficiency over thoroughness, by skipping key investigative steps or relying on incomplete information, is also unacceptable. The risk assessment process is a critical safeguard. Expediency should never come at the expense of due diligence, as this could result in overlooking significant disqualifying factors and compromising public safety. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant Wisconsin statutes and administrative codes governing concealed carry licenses. This framework should mandate a systematic collection and review of all pertinent information, with a specific focus on disqualifying factors. It should also include provisions for objective evaluation, ensuring that decisions are based on evidence rather than speculation or bias. Regular training on risk assessment methodologies and legal updates is crucial to maintain proficiency and ensure consistent, fair, and legally compliant decision-making. Question 15. Cost-benefit analysis shows that in Wisconsin, when encountering a potentially threatening individual in a public place, What is the most prudent course of action to minimize risk and adhere to responsible concealed carry principles? Option A. Maintain situational awareness. Assess the threat from a distance, and if possible, create separation or move to a safer location, only considering drawing a weapon if an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm arises. Option B. Ignore the individual and continue with your original activity, assuming they pose no real danger. Option C. Immediately draw your concealed weapon to deter the individual and signal your readiness to defend yourself. Option D. Directly confront the individual, demanding to know their intentions and challenging their presence. The correct answer is A. Maintain situational awareness, assess the threat from a distance, and if possible, create separation or move to a safer location, only considering drawing a weapon if an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm arises. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual to balance the legal right to carry a concealed weapon with the responsibility to act in a manner that does not create an undue risk to themselves or others. The decision-making process must be grounded in a thorough understanding of Wisconsin's concealed carry laws and a realistic assessment of potential threats and the effectiveness of various responses. A hasty or overly aggressive approach can lead to unintended consequences, including legal repercussions and increased danger. The best approach involves a proactive and de-escalatory strategy that prioritizes avoiding confrontation and ensuring personal safety through situational awareness and strategic positioning. This aligns with the principle of responsible gun ownership, which emphasizes using a firearm only as a last resort for self-defense when facing an imminent threat of death or great bodily harm. Wisconsin law, while permitting concealed carry, does not mandate or encourage its use in situations that can be resolved without resorting to force. This approach focuses on minimizing risk by observing, assessing, and creating distance if possible, thereby avoiding the need to draw or discharge a weapon unless absolutely necessary. An approach that immediately draws a concealed weapon upon perceiving a potential threat, without further assessment or attempt at de-escalation, is professionally unacceptable. This action escalates the situation and creates an immediate risk of unintended harm, potentially violating the principle of using force only when necessary and proportionate to the threat. It fails to consider less lethal options or the possibility that the perceived threat may be benign or resolvable through other means. Another professionally unacceptable approach is to ignore the perceived threat entirely and continue with one's activities without any attempt to assess the situation or enhance personal safety. This demonstrates a lack of situational awareness and a failure to exercise due diligence in protecting oneself and potentially others. While not escalating the situation, it leaves the individual vulnerable to a genuine threat that could have been mitigated through a more cautious response. Finally, an approach that involves confronting the perceived threat directly and aggressively, demanding an explanation or challenging their presence, is also professionally unsound. This can be interpreted as an aggressive act and may provoke a violent response, turning a potentially non-threatening situation into a dangerous confrontation. It bypasses the crucial step of assessing the threat and exploring de-escalation or avoidance strategies. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with heightened situational awareness. Upon perceiving a potential threat, the immediate step should be to observe and assess the nature and severity of the threat. If possible and safe to do so, creating distance or seeking a more secure location is paramount. Drawing a weapon should only be considered when there is an imminent and unavoidable threat of death or great bodily harm, and even then, the goal is to deter the threat, not to initiate a confrontation. Question 16. Implementation of responsible judgment by a Wisconsin licensee to carry a concealed weapon is paramount when observing suspicious activity. If a licensee witnesses two individuals loitering near parked vehicles in a dimly lit parking lot, exhibiting furtive movements and appearing to be attempting to pry open a car door, what is the most legally and ethically sound course of action? Option A. Follow the individuals at a discreet distance to gather more information about their intentions before deciding whether to report. Option B. Approach the individuals directly and verbally challenge their behavior to deter them from continuing. Option C. Assume criminal intent based on their loitering and furtive movements, and prepare to use the concealed weapon if they make any aggressive moves. Option D. Immediately contact the local law enforcement agency to report the observed suspicious activity, and provide a detailed description of the individuals and their actions. The correct answer is D. Immediately contact the local law enforcement agency to report the observed suspicious activity and provide a detailed description of the individuals and their actions. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the strict legal requirements for carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. The core of the challenge lies in understanding the nuances of Wisconsin Statute 943:10, which governs concealed carry, and ensuring that any action taken is both legally permissible and ethically sound, prioritizing public safety and adherence to the law. A critical aspect is recognizing that the license to carry a concealed weapon is not a license to engage in vigilantism or to use force preemptively. The best approach involves immediate and responsible reporting of suspicious activity to the proper authorities. This aligns with the legal framework of Wisconsin, which grants a license for concealed carry for the purpose of self-defense in specific, immediate threats. By contacting law enforcement, the individual fulfills their civic duty to report potential criminal activity without taking matters into their own hands. This approach respects the established legal channels for addressing threats and avoids escalating a situation or misinterpreting circumstances, which could lead to legal repercussions or endangerment of oneself or others. It upholds the principle that the authority to use force is vested in law enforcement and only permissible for the licensee in direct, imminent danger. An incorrect approach would be to confront the individuals directly, even if the intent is to deter them or gather more information. This action could be construed as an unlawful threat or an act of aggression, potentially violating Wisconsin Statute 943:10 by creating a situation where the concealed weapon is brandished or used without an immediate, justifiable threat to life or limb. Another incorrect approach would be to follow the individuals at a distance to observe their actions further. While seemingly less confrontational, this could still be interpreted as harassment or intimidation, and it places the individual in a position of escalating a situation without the direct involvement of law enforcement, potentially leading to a misunderstanding or a confrontation that could have been avoided by simply reporting the initial suspicion. Furthermore, assuming criminal intent based solely on appearance or behavior is a significant ethical and legal failure, as it can lead to profiling and unwarranted actions. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation, adherence to legal statutes, and reliance on established authorities. This involves assessing the situation from a safe distance, focusing on observable facts rather than assumptions, and understanding the limitations and responsibilities associated with a concealed carry license. The primary directive is to report suspicious activity to law enforcement and allow them to investigate, reserving the use of the concealed weapon strictly for situations of immediate and unavoidable danger to life or great bodily harm. Question 17. To address the challenge of responsibly exercising the right to carry a concealed weapon in Wisconsin while shopping at a busy grocery store, which of the following actions best reflects professional judgment and adherence to legal and ethical standards? Option A. Maintain a discreet demeanor, ensuring the firearm remains concealed and avoiding any actions that might draw attention to its presence. Option B. Engage in a loud and assertive conversation with a store employee about a minor product issue, drawing attention to yourself. Option C. Frequently adjust your waistband or jacket in the area where the firearm is holstered, making others aware of its location. Option D. Casually mention to a fellow shopper that you are legally carrying a concealed firearm for protection. The correct answer is A. Maintain a discreet demeanor, ensuring the firearm remains concealed and avoiding any actions that might draw attention to its presence. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the legal right to carry a concealed weapon in Wisconsin with the responsibility to act ethically and avoid creating unnecessary alarm or potential danger. The presence of a firearm, even legally carried, can be perceived differently by the public, and the licensee's actions must be mindful of this perception and the potential for misinterpretation. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the exercise of the right to carry does not inadvertently escalate a situation or violate the spirit of responsible firearm ownership. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves maintaining a low profile and avoiding any actions that could be construed as threatening or provocative. This means keeping the firearm concealed as required by Wisconsin law, not displaying it, and acting in a manner that does not draw undue attention to the fact that a weapon is being carried. The licensee should focus on their intended purpose, such as shopping, and remain aware of their surroundings, without engaging in behavior that might be misinterpreted as aggressive or indicative of intent to use the weapon. This approach aligns with the Wisconsin statute's emphasis on concealed carry and the ethical obligation of licensees to be responsible and discreet. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves openly discussing the presence of the concealed firearm with others in the store. This action is professionally unacceptable because it unnecessarily draws attention to the weapon, potentially causing alarm among other patrons and staff, and could be misinterpreted as a display of intent or a threat, even if not intended as such. It deviates from the principle of concealed carry and can create a public disturbance. Another incorrect approach is to conspicuously adjust clothing or reach towards the area where the firearm is concealed in a manner that is visible to others. This behavior can be perceived as a preparatory action for drawing the weapon, leading to fear and potential intervention by store security or law enforcement, and is a failure to maintain discreet concealment. Finally, engaging in aggressive or confrontational behavior while carrying the concealed weapon, even if unrelated to the firearm itself, is professionally unacceptable. While the right to carry is granted, it does not confer a right to behave aggressively. Such actions can lead to escalation of minor disputes and create a dangerous situation, demonstrating a severe lapse in judgment and responsibility. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this situation should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes safety, discretion, and adherence to the law. This involves a continuous assessment of the environment and one's own behavior. The primary consideration should always be to exercise the right to carry a concealed weapon responsibly and without causing undue concern or risk to oneself or others. This means understanding the legal requirements for concealment and acting in a manner that is consistent with being a law-abiding citizen who is prepared for self-defense, rather than seeking confrontation or drawing attention. Question 18. The review process indicates that an applicant for a Wisconsin license to carry a concealed weapon has a history of domestic violence restraining orders that are no longer active. What is the most appropriate course of action for the licensing authority? Option A. Automatically deny the license application due to the past existence of domestic violence restraining orders, regardless of their current status. Option B. Issue the license without further investigation, assuming that the expiration of the restraining orders signifies no ongoing risk. Option C. Conduct a detailed review of the specific circumstances and legal status of the past restraining orders to determine if they constitute a disqualifying factor under Wisconsin Statute Section 941, 235, and related statutes. Option D. Grant the license based on the applicant's assertion that the restraining orders were unfounded, without seeking independent verification. Correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed review of the specific circumstances and legal status of the past restraining orders to determine if they constitute a disqualifying factor under Wisconsin Statute Section 941, 235, and related statutes. Explanation. The review process indicates a scenario where an applicant for a Wisconsin license to carry a concealed weapon has a history of domestic violence restraining orders. This situation is professionally challenging because it requires a careful balancing of an individual's right to self-defense with the state's compelling interest in public safety and the prevention of violence, particularly in domestic contexts. The Wisconsin statutes governing concealed carry are designed to identify individuals who pose a potential risk to themselves or others. A thorough risk assessment is paramount to ensure compliance with these statutes and to uphold ethical responsibilities. The correct approach involves a meticulous review of the applicant's history, specifically focusing on the nature, recency, and circumstances surrounding any domestic violence restraining orders. This approach aligns with Wisconsin Statute Section 941, 235, which outlines the criteria for issuing a license and includes prohibitions for individuals subject to certain court orders, such as domestic abuse injunctions. The law requires the licensing authority to deny a license if the applicant is subject to a domestic abuse injunction under Section 813, 12, or a harassment injunction under Section 813, 125, or if they have been convicted of a domestic violence crime. A comprehensive assessment would involve not just the existence of a restraining order, but also its terms, duration, and whether it has been violated. This detailed examination ensures that the decision is based on a thorough understanding of the applicant's legal standing and potential risk, adhering strictly to the statutory requirements for public safety. An incorrect approach would be to automatically deny the license solely based on the existence of any restraining order without further investigation. This fails to acknowledge that restraining orders can be temporary, may have expired, or might have been issued under circumstances that do not necessarily indicate a present danger or a disqualifying condition under Wisconsin law. Such an approach risks an arbitrary denial and may not fully comply with the due process considerations inherent in licensing decisions. Another incorrect approach would be to grant the license without any specific inquiry into the restraining orders, assuming that the mere passage of time or the absence of a current conviction negates any risk. This overlooks the legislative intent behind including such provisions in the concealed carry statutes, which is to proactively identify and mitigate potential threats. The law requires a proactive assessment of disqualifying factors, not a passive acceptance of an applicant's claims. A third incorrect approach would be to rely on anecdotal information or assumptions about the applicant's character without concrete evidence or legal findings. This deviates from the objective standards set forth in Wisconsin law and introduces subjective biases into the decision-making process, which is ethically unsound and legally impermissible. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes a thorough, objective, and legally compliant review of all relevant information. This involves understanding the specific statutory disqualifiers, meticulously examining the applicant's documented history, and making a determination based on the evidence and the law, rather than on assumptions or incomplete information. The process should be transparent and adhere to due process principles. Question 19. Examination of the data shows that a licensed individual carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin encounters a tense verbal confrontation in a public place. The other individual is agitated, shouting, and gesturing aggressively, but is not physically touching the licensed individual and does not appear to be armed. What is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Immediately draw the concealed weapon to deter the agitated individual from further aggression. Option B. Respond with equally aggressive verbal commands to assert dominance and de-escalate the situation. Option C. Disengage from the confrontation by calmly and safely moving away from the agitated individual if possible, while remaining aware of the surroundings. Option D. Assume the agitated individual intends to cause serious harm and prepare to use the concealed weapon for self-defense. The correct answer is C. Disengage from the confrontation by calmly and safely moving away from the agitated individual, if possible, while remaining aware of the surroundings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance their right to self-defense with the legal obligations and responsibilities associated with carrying a concealed weapon in Wisconsin. The core of the challenge lies in accurately assessing a situation to determine if the use of deadly force is legally justified and ethically sound, without overreacting or failing to act when necessary. Careful judgment is paramount to avoid legal repercussions and ensure responsible firearm ownership. The best approach involves a thorough and objective assessment of the immediate threat. This means evaluating the totality of the circumstances, including the aggressor's actions, words, and apparent intent, as well as the presence of any weapons or other means to inflict serious bodily harm or death. It requires considering whether there is a reasonable belief that such harm is imminent and unavoidable through any other means. This aligns with Wisconsin Statute 939-48, which outlines the justification for the use of deadly force, emphasizing the need for a reasonable belief of imminent death or great bodily harm. The ethical imperative is to use force only as a last resort when all other reasonable options have been exhausted or are unavailable. An incorrect approach would be to rely solely on a subjective feeling of fear or intimidation without concrete evidence of an imminent threat. This fails to meet the legal standard of a reasonable belief of imminent death or great bodily harm. Another incorrect approach is to escalate a situation that could be de-escalated through non-violent means, or to use force to retaliate or punish. This violates the principle that force must be used only for self-preservation against an immediate threat. Finally, assuming that simply being licensed to carry a concealed weapon grants permission to use it in any perceived uncomfortable or threatening situation is a grave misunderstanding of the law and ethical responsibility. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes objective threat assessment, adherence to legal statutes, and ethical considerations. This involves pausing to analyze the situation, identifying the specific nature and imminence of any threat, and considering all available, reasonable alternatives to the use of force. The decision to use deadly force should be a last resort, undertaken only when there is a clear and present danger of death or great bodily harm that cannot be avoided by other means. Question 20. Upon reviewing a scenario in Wisconsin where you are legally licensed to carry a concealed weapon, you observe a loud and heated argument occurring between two individuals in a public park. The argument is escalating, with raised voices and aggressive posturing, but no physical contact or overt threats of violence are immediately apparent. Considering Wisconsin's concealed carry laws, what is the most prudent and legally sound course of action to take? Option A. Immediately draw your concealed weapon and verbally command the individuals to stop arguing, asserting your right to carry. Option B. Approach the individuals involved in the argument, place your hand on your concealed firearm, and demand they cease their behavior. Option C. Maintain situational awareness, assess for an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, and only consider drawing your concealed weapon if such a threat materializes. If no immediate threat is present, seek to de-escalate through non-confrontational means or disengage. Option D. Immediately call law enforcement and loudly announce that you are carrying a concealed weapon and are prepared to defend yourself. The correct answer is C. Maintain situational awareness, assess for an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, and only consider drawing your concealed weapon if such a threat materializes. If no immediate threat is present, seek to de-escalate through non-confrontational means or disengage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge involving the interpretation and application of Wisconsin's concealed carry laws in a dynamic, potentially high-stress situation. The core difficulty lies in balancing the legal right to carry a concealed weapon with the responsibility to act in a manner that does not escalate a situation or create undue alarm, while also considering the potential for misinterpretation of one's actions by others. Careful judgment is required to assess the immediate threat, the legality of one's actions, and the potential consequences of any decision. Correct approach analysis. The best professional practice involves a calm, measured, and legally compliant response. This means maintaining situational awareness, assessing the threat level without immediate escalation, and only drawing a concealed weapon if there is an immediate and articulable threat of death or great bodily harm, as defined by Wisconsin Statute Section 943. 10. If the situation de-escalates or the threat is not immediate, the legally permissible action is to disengage or seek to de-escalate through nonviolent means, while remaining aware of the surroundings. This approach prioritizes legal compliance with Wisconsin's concealed carry statutes and the fundamental principle of using deadly force only as a last resort when facing imminent danger. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately drawing the concealed weapon upon perceiving a loud argument. This fails to meet the legal threshold for drawing a firearm under Wisconsin law, which requires an immediate threat of death or great bodily harm, not merely the presence of conflict. This action could be construed as an aggressive act, potentially escalating the situation and leading to legal repercussions for brandishing a weapon without justification. Another incorrect approach is to confront the individuals involved in the argument and verbally demand they cease their behavior, while keeping a hand on the concealed firearm. This approach risks direct engagement without a clear and present danger, potentially placing the individual in a position of initiating a confrontation. It also fails to adhere to the principle of de-escalation and could be interpreted as an attempt to intimidate or control the situation through the implied presence of a weapon, which is not a legally sanctioned use of a concealed carry permit. A further incorrect approach is to immediately call law enforcement and then loudly announce that you are carrying a concealed weapon and are prepared to defend yourself. While calling law enforcement is often prudent, the loud announcement and declaration of readiness to defend can be perceived as an aggressive posture, potentially alarming the individuals involved and escalating the situation unnecessarily. It also bypasses the legal requirement to only draw a weapon when facing an immediate threat. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes de-escalation, legal compliance, and threat assessment. This involves 1. Maintaining situational awareness and assessing the environment. 2. Identifying the nature and imminence of any threat. 3. Considering all available nonviolent de-escalation options. 4. If a threat is immediate and articulable, only then considering the use of a concealed weapon as a last resort, in accordance with Wisconsin Statute Section 943. 10. 5. If the situation does not meet the legal threshold for drawing a weapon, disengaging or continuing to monitor the situation from a safe distance while awaiting law enforcement if necessary.